All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to transition away from talking about visual motor actions in general and just focus on the motor system overall. So just really focus on movement and action in general. Okay, so to give you a little sense of orientation, if this is your brain, this is actually what has been highlighted is all the parts, are all the parts of the brain that are involved in motor activities of a wide variety. And so there's a bunch of areas we're going to talk about later. For example, Broca's area is involved in the movements of your mouth specifically associated with speech. Your cerebellum, we talked a little bit about several weeks ago, is involved in a wide variety of motor actions. And if you damage that area and you get cerebral palsy, you have a lot of these motor deficits. But it really starts with primary motor cortex, which actually straddles the line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And so actually this big gap down here, which is called the central sulcus that divides these yellow and orange regions, is the division between the frontal lobe on the left and the parietal lobe on the right. And the primary motor cortex is right there with the primary sensory cortex, in this case, somatosensory cortex, right next to it, which we're going to talk about in the next little lecture unit. Okay, so let's start with primary motor cortex and talk about what the dominant organizing principle of primary motor cortex is. We talked about this a little bit in discussion section in week 3, in week 3, when we were talking about somatosensory systems, and it's actually pretty related in the sense that there is a map of your person on your motor cortex, similar to the way there's a map of your person in your somatosensory cortex, which we're going to talk about again in a little bit. So we're going to leave this blank so we can focus on it here. And so all of these different parts of your brain, as you kind of scroll up and down this swath of cortex, correspond to different parts of your body. So these parts right here are involved in moving your hands. These parts right here are involved in moving your toes, your tongue, and so on and so forth. One thing I want to draw attention to is that the way that the brain has represented the body is not perfectly symmetrical. Notice how large the face is relative to, say, your trunk and your torso. And that's because your brain actually overrepresents certain parts of your body when it comes to the motor system more than others. And so to make that a point abundantly clear, sometimes scientists draw this thing which is referred to as a sensory homunculus, which is basically showing, relatively speaking, how much of your brain is dedicated to different parts of your body. And so what you can see is that with your motor system devotes way more cortex to your hands, your fingers, your lips, and your tongue than parts, say, like your legs, your knees, your feet, and so forth. Why would that be? Evolutionarily, I think it makes a lot of sense. You use your hands a lot to manipulate things in the world. You use your mouth a lot to speak. It makes sense that you would want to over prioritize those types of things. I think for a lot of people, fine motor skills and with their hands and fine motor skills with their mouth are two of the more important aspects of their motor system. They would want to keep those at all other costs. Okay, so a thing I want to do though is take a little step back and think about how you would actually go about mapping a person's motor cortex. And we're going to talk about it in the context of fMRI, but it's useful to also have in mind how you could potentially do this with other methods like TMS, microstimulation, brain damage, and so forth. And the way that it could be done, and in fact, the way it was done several years ago in a non-invasive way, back in like, the 90s probably, is you put someone in a magnet, an fMRI machine, and you get them to move different parts of their body, and you just see how the different bits of activation spread out across the cortex as a function of what you are actually asking them to move. And so what you can see, for example, is that, if you have them move their elbow versus you have their index finger versus their thumb, that's just, 3 little instances right there where you can see the different aspects of the brain getting lit up as a function of the particular thing that they're moving. So you could literally put someone in the magnet if you wanted to and have them move as many things as they could possibly physically move: their fingers, their hands, their elbow, their shoulder, their mouth, their toes, their knee, whatever. And you can just see the bit of activity go up and down the motor cortex. So this strip of brain, the primary motor cortex, the primary motor cortex is really where motion activation signals really start in the brain. And they'll really propagate from the primary motor cortex through other parts of structures down the spine. And eventually what they will do is they will innervate with the muscles. And so what you'll see is just like what I was describing, where you'll have your initial signal up here in the brain. It'll come down through the brainstem into the spinal cord, and then it'll across these nerves in the peripheral system it will actually innervate with these muscles in this different way. So pay attention to this one over here on the right, because this is just like a little GIF. And if you're activating one part of your brain to activate your biceps, you'll have one nerve, it'll innervate with this muscle. If you want to do with your triceps, it'll innervate with that muscle, sorry. And so it's just this chain of activation that goes literally from your brain down your spinal cord to your muscles that causes these things to activate. And what you can even do is you can look at using this thing called EMG, which is basically looking at muscle activation, and you can see a similar sort of spike in activity in the different muscles as a function of what you're trying to do and how you're trying to move, which is related to the particular part of your body that you're trying to move. So in this case, these motor neurons from the central nervous system come down to the peripheral nervous system. If you want to straighten your arm, you'll activate your triceps. If you want to bend your arm, you'll activate your biceps, okay? So it's a chain of neurons originating in the brain that ultimately ends at a muscle, okay? But interestingly enough, as I'm sure a lot of you are kind of aware, many motor actions don't even involve the brain at all, okay? What's an example? What do I mean by a situation in which you could have your body move, but your actual cerebral cortex doesn't get involved? The most well-known examples of these are, of course, reflexes. So probably the most famous reflex there is this one that's referred to as the stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex is that thing that you would have done to you when you're like a kid, or you go to the doctor's office, where they tap this part of your knee right here, and it causes your leg to kick out, okay? So why does hitting that tendon here in your knee cause the kick, okay? What's going on is you have your muscle spindle, and what goes on is that when you hit the tendon right here, it stretches that muscle spindle, which sends a signal down this fiber to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will do a little computation right there. That's what that orange neuron is, which will spend another another signal down another neuron or another fiber, which will then actually oppose the flexor, which will cause it to like kick out. Basically, you have this closed loop circuit. That's just the big thing I want you to know, is when you stretch the muscle in this way, there's automatically like kind of a balancing type of factor, because if this sort of sensory system thinks that the muscle's getting stretched, it will want to contract it to balance things out. It's just trying to maintain some sense of equilibrium, okay? Now, why does this signal sort of exist, or why does this process exist, and why does it exclude the brain, and why is it evolutionarily advantageous? Really what's going on is that it's thought that this sort of process here is actually useful in maintaining balance. It helps maintain balance without actually even having to get the brain involved. The sort of thing, if you're walking on like a rugged terrain, this sort of like give and take between these different sort of systems is naturally always happening in this sort of closed loop system. And it doesn't require any of the cortical resources. And cortical resources are finite, and they are limited. A couple of lectures ago, when we were talking about object recognition and attention, we talked about how you have finite brain resources, and so you need attention to kind of focus those resources on certain things. This is something that through evolution, our bodies have figured out can be automated, and it helps us maintain balance without needing to get the costly central nervous system involved. So that's one example of a reflex. I wonder if anyone can think of another type of reflex. My personal favorite other one is referred to as the withdraw reflex. So this is that thing where, like, if you accidentally like touch a hot stove or a hot pot or something, and then you move your hand away, and you kind of, if you think about it, you move your hand away almost before you realize that it hurts. Like, I don't know about you all, but sometimes like you'll touch one of these things, and it's not like you touch it, feel a lot of heat, and then move away. It's almost like you touch it, move away, and then feel the heat. And it's a similar type of thing where it's this sort of closed loop circuit without having to get the cortex involved. And so what's going on is that dendrites that are in your finger will have the actual sensory neurons that can process the feeling of the hot surface. They send a signal down a sensory neuron, which is associated with pain. And then this neuron here will cause a motor neuron to get excited, which will then cause the resulting muscular contraction of your, in this case, I guess it would be your bicep. And so what goes on is then that signal gets sent down the motor neuron, innervates with the bicep, which ultimately causes the hand to pull away. And then similarly, why is this evolutionarily advantageous? It's again the type of thing where you don't necessarily need to do this sort of processing, this sort of computation with the brain involved. And actually, there's another element of evolutionary advantage. Yeah, an evolutionary advantage here, which is basically the fact that all those the time it takes to go through all these processes, to go through your arm, to your spine, up to your brain, process something in your brain, go down your spine, back to your arm, that takes time. The longer the time, the more your finger is touching the thing that's burning, the more your finger is touching the thing that's burning, the more likely you are to get hurt. So actually another advantage is the fact that by skipping the cerebral cortex, by kind of skipping the middleman, as it were, you are able to save time and get your hand out of a dangerous situation faster than it would be otherwise. Okay, so how do you go from the brain to the muscles? What exactly is going on when these neurons meet the muscle themselves? Because I've kind of just been glossing over it, but what's going on is that you have neurons, just like here, okay, and they're actually the axons of these neurons for what are called alpha motor neurons, that don't touch other neurons. It's not like the axons meet the dendrites of other neurons. Instead, the axons literally meet the muscle fibers, okay? So how does that work? How do you go from the electrical activity we've talked about with neurons to a muscle actually moving? So the way it works is actually using a very similar process to what goes on when two neurons talk. When two neurons talk and when a neuron talks to a muscle, it's actually really not that different. Because what's going on in this situation is that a neuron will release a neurotransmitter that is called acetylcholine, okay? And when acetylcholine gets bathed onto a muscle, it will cause the muscle to contract, okay? So if you took a syringe of acetylcholine and injected it into your arm and just squirted acetylcholine, your muscle would involuntarily contract like that. It would get flexed, as it were. And it really is actually the same sort of neuronal story that we've been telling this whole time, okay? Because the type of thing that's going on is you have a synapse between the axon and the muscle that looks really similar to when you have an axon meeting a dendrite, okay? Because when an axon meets a dendrite, it looks like this. And aside, from a couple of little things, if I, just label this not as muscle activation, but just as a dendrite, it could actually pass as a dendrite because it's really the same sort of principle. And what's going on, oh, sorry, my computer's having a little problem. Yeah, and what's going on is you will have your neurotransmitters that are in the vesicles, which will be acetylcholine. When the electronic charge comes down here, it releases acetylcholine, and when the acetylcholine binds with these receptors that are on the muscle will contract when those channels open. It's the same type of thing we've been talking about when we talk about neural communication in general. It's the same type of thing that we've been talking about, for example, a couple weeks ago in vision, when visual neurons interact with one another. So it's really not a different process. It's really applying the same concept that we've been learning, except in this case, it's muscles that are going to contract rather than another signal go down another neuron. Now, sometimes you can have actually autoimmune disorders that will affect this process. So for example, certain autoimmune disorders will have antibodies that will actually get into this junction between the neurons and the muscles, and it will kind of cause the muscle activation to be inhibited because the acetylcholine can't properly bind with these little receptor sites. And so there are certain autoimmune disorders where people have problems moving. Parkinson's, for example, can sometimes be something kind of like this. And a possible cause for it is literally just because you get these antibodies that just block the system from working, okay? So that's a nice simple example of how these really, really small little, ligands and neurotransmitters and antibody cells can have a much more global effect on a person's capabilities and behavior just because this system will break down because of this disorder. Sometimes, though, people are able to use knowledge of this system for good. So this is, of course, unfortunate when people lose, the ability to use their limbs. But sometimes, for example, when you're having surgery, one of the aspects of getting put under general anesthesia is that you will be given a paralytic. As I'm sure a lot of you know, you can be asleep and still move. People sometimes sleepwalk. Sometimes you'll roll around in your sleep and you not even wake up. A lot of times the anesthesias that doctors will give you to get you to go to sleep will not necessarily prevent you from moving around. So in addition to giving you an anesthetic, they will sometimes give you a paralytic. And so, for example, there's a fairly well-known paralytic that's called I always struggle with this. Rocuronium. Yeah, there's this one sort of paralytic called rocuronium, which does something similar actually to what the antibodies are doing over here. They get into this synapse, they block the acetylcholine from binding with the muscles, and then therefore they prevent the muscles from contracting and the muscles from moving, okay? So what is going on in the brain such that the neurons can actually kind of dictate explicit motor actions? If you want to, reach for a bottle, if you want to grab, I don't know why I have it on my desk, but I do, a chopstick, what is going on in your motor system such that you are able to move in these explicit goal-directed ways. So the best way to explain this, I think, comes from these studies that have actually been done in awake primates. So in this study, what is going on is a monkey literally will have a little bar that the monkey is holding, and then there will be like a table of lights, and the monkey will just move the bar to wherever the light lights up. So, you know, I'm the monkey holding this here, and a light flashes over there, I'll move it over to the left. If it flashes over here, I'll move it over to the right, up, down, left, right, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And so what you can do is while the monkey is moving in this way, you can put your electrodes in the monkey's brain, but specifically put your electrodes in the monkey's brain in the part that corresponds to the monkey's arm, because the monkey's brain, or specifically the monkey's motor system, is organized like ours in this sort of, you know, body specific type of way. So you can just ask yourself, okay, when the monkey moves in different ways, let's look at the neurons that are associated with the arm and let's see what they're doing. And it turns out when the monkey is doing this little, you know, bar on the light task, what you find is that the neurons will fire when the monkey moves its arm in a specific direction, okay? So for example, anytime the monkey seems to move his hand to the left or his arm to the left, the neurons in the motor cortex fire. If the monkey moves his arm to the right, the neurons in the motor cortex don't fire. And again, each one of these little dots is just showing you an action potential. Each one of these these rows is just a different neuron. So in this case, they're measuring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 neurons. And this solid line that you see here and there and there and there, that's just when the actual motor coordination starts. So that's when the monkey moves, okay? Okay, so this is just the firing from one neuron or one cluster of neurons. And it is showing that in this case, this particular neuron has a leftward selectivity, okay? In the same way that we've talked about how visual neurons can sometimes have orientation selectivity and all these different things, we're now seeing in this case here that a motor neuron can also have an orientation selectivity, which in this case is to the left, okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to look at these two plots that I'm gonna show you here, and I want you to think about this question of, do these neurons that I'm showing you seem to respond to a location or to a direction? Okay, so we've got two different situations here. One is the bar starts in the middle of the the little table, and the monkey moves it away from the middle to one of these outer locations. Or the monkey starts with his hand on the outside and moves the bar to the middle of it, okay? So in this situation, the monkey starts in the middle, moves its hand out, middle, hand out, middle, hand out. In this situation over here on the right, the monkey would start with its hand on the outside, move it to the middle, start with its hand on the outside, move it to the middle, outside, move it to the middle, okay? So take a second and look at this data and think about whether or not these neurons that you're seeing here respond to a direction of motion versus a particular location, okay? So in this particular situation, you would want to say that these neurons really don't seem like they care about a location, they care about the direction. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because let's focus on this one line coming down this way, okay? In this situation here, what I'm depicting is what this neuron does, or what these neurons do, when the monkey's hand starts in the middle and moves to the bottom of the display, or moves to the bottom of the table, okay? Neuron gets really excited. In this situation, however, the monkey's hand starts at the very top of the display and moves to the middle. But notice, it gets really excited here, it gets really excited here. In this situation here, the monkey's hand starts out or ends up at the bottom of the table. In this situation here, the monkey's hand ends up in the middle of the table. So the hands are moving to different locations, but the neurons both seem to still be getting active. So why are they getting active if the monkey's moving its hand to different locations? Because in both cases, the monkey is moving his hand in the same direction, which in this case is down. And so this is an example of how people are able to dissociate between whether or not it's a direction neuron or if it's a location neuron. Because from this plot that I showed you a second ago, someone could say like, oh, maybe this has nothing to do with direction. Maybe this is all about just the monkey's neuron gets really excited when he puts his hand here. Then scientists were like, well, no, if that was the case, then you should see differences when the monkey moves his hand down. In this case, that ends in one location versus if the monkey moves his hand down, in this case, to a different location, okay? So a natural question to wonder is, well, does one neuron in motor cortex determine where a limb will go? Is it really just one neuron or maybe 2 or 3 neurons that are firing? No, it's actually a really complicated combination of a bunch of neurons firing simultaneously that will determine where the neuron goes. And this forms what is referred to as a population vector, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the response of 241 neurons, and how all of those different neurons respond when a person moves a joystick in different directions, okay? So each one of these red lines is just showing you which direction the person, in this case, moved a little joystick up, down, left, right, whatever. And then the gray lines are corresponding to activity of individual neurons. So for example, this arrow right here is showing you like the neurons that get really excited when a person, in this case, moves his hand 90 degrees upwards. Okay, so this neuron right here, this gray line corresponds to one neuron, is getting really excited when this person moves their hand this way. This neuron here, it's still pretty excited, but not quite as excited. This neuron here, not really that excited at all. This neuron here, not really excited even a little bit. There's actually even a bunch of neurons down here we can't even see, okay? On the flip side, when a person takes their hand and now doesn't go up 90 degrees, but goes down 270 degrees, all these neurons up here that are getting really excited, we can see that those neurons now are not nearly as excited, okay? Because those neurons don't like it when the person moves down. Those neurons like it when the person moves up. But now a whole different other population of neurons is getting much more excited when the person is moving their the hand down. Because again, each one of these little gray lines corresponds to the activity of one different neuron, okay? So what in reality is going on is that in your motor system, a population of neurons, a whole suite of neurons will be voting, as it were, at a given time. And the direction that the limb will go in this case will be the byproduct of that sort of voting process. When the voting process is such that these people up here, or these neurons up here, have a really strong voice saying, go up, go up, go up, then that's what the limb's gonna do. Whereas, when it's saying go down, go down, go down, that's what the limb's gonna do, okay? I do wonder if this notion about patterns of activity corresponding with something specific might remind you of anything. I hope that it does, because from a little while ago, we talked about patterns of activity in a different context. We talked about it in the context of object recognition, where your brain can recognize something as a face, your brain can recognize something as a house, not by one neuron, not by one area, but by an entire pattern of activity. It's the similar type of concept now in this case here with the motor system, where basically your brain will look at a whole pattern of activity on the motor system, not just one neuron, not just one little area, and from that whole pattern, we'll figure out, oh, okay, we're supposed to move our limbs in this way, we're supposed to move our limbs in that way. So that means we've seen actually two kind of similar things between the neurons in the motor system and the neurons in the visual system. The first thing that I pointed out to you was about how you can see orientation selectivity in motor neurons, similar to the way you could see, orientation selectivity in visual neurons. And again, we can see sort of population activity playing a big role in determining movement, where similarly population activity of neurons is going to determine what a person is perceiving and what a person is processing. And I'm pointing this out just because even though, motor system, visual system are doing very different things, you can see that there are some underlying commonalities, that there's certain principles that the brain recycles again and again. It can be applied from one modality in one sensory domain to another one. Okay, so let's take a break there. And when we come back, we'll now talk about what's happening right next door in the brain and the parietal lobe to the motor system. And we're going to move from talking about action to somatosensation, which is known a little bit more commonly as touch. So when we come back, we'll talk about how your body is able to process things that you touch out in the world.